Today we're going to remove a Honda GX390's carburetor and go over the basic principles of how the system works. We will also tear apart the carburetor and show all of the insides. Let's start with how fuel gets to the carburetor. On the bottom of the gas tank, you can see the fuel drain. Attached to the fuel drain is a fuel line. Following the fuel line, it'll lead directly to the carburetor. But attached to the carburetor is a fuel shutoff valve. The purpose of the fuel shutoff valve is pretty self-explanatory. It's simply to shut off the fuel. Next, let's remove the carburetor. For time's sake, I've already removed the air filter cover and the air filter and the plate underneath. To remove these, there are simply two wing nuts. Next, remove the 3 bolts holding the carburetor on. For me, they were all 3 10mm, 2 on bottom and 1 on top. Next, remove the cover, being careful that there may be a crankcase vent hose on the back. Next, let's remove the fuel line. To remove the fuel line, there will be a D-clamp on it. You simply squeeze it and pull it up the fuel line. You may have to give a slight twist to the fuel line to break it loose from the brass nipple. It is best to either drain the fuel or to crimp the line up high enough above the fuel level that it will not drain out. In this case, I zip tied it to the frame. Next, we remove the governor arm and spring. Next, I remove the choke cable. To do this, I pull the 2 screws that clamp down the cable. You don't have to do this most of the time. For this sake, I went ahead and did it. Next, I remove the choke arm plate and the carburetor off the 2 studs, sliding it off carefully. Next, we're going to go over the functions of a carburetor and what the carburetor does. Here's the fuel shutoff valve, and to the right is the brass inlet. Next, we have the choke plate. The purpose of the choke plate is to reduce the amount of air coming in and increasing the amount of fuel, therefore richening the circuit. On the other side of the carburetor, we have the throttle plate. When the throttle plate is opened up, it allows more volume of air and fuel to enter the engine. Next, we have the idle speed adjustment, as well as an air mixture screw. On the bottom is the fuel bowl. The left bolt is a drain. The right bolt holds the fuel bowl on. Let's remove the right bolt and start disassembling the carburetor. The fuel bowl simply pulls off, being careful not to damage the seal. When the fuel rises in the bowl, the white float rises and pushes the float needle into the float needle seat, therefore shutting off the fuel to the inside of the carburetor. Here is a picture of the inside of the bottom of the carburetor. On the bottom is the float needle seat. In the very center is where the main jet is. The main jet has a slot in it. To remove the main jet, stick a flathead screwdriver down the center of that center hole. Turn left to loosen. The main jet is the small one. The emulsion tube is the longer one with many holes in it. Make sure both of these are clear. You should be able to see through all holes clearly. Next, let's look at how this system works. Fuel comes into the carburetor and fills the carburetor bowl. It then flows through the small main jet, which controls how much fuel overall is allowed out of the carburetor and into the engine. It then gets flown up to the emulsion tube. The emulsion tube helps atomize it with the air, resulting in better combustion. I forgot to mention this before when we were going over the carburetor, but this little hole right here, as you can see, it actually flows outside. It has a countersunk channel that flows all the way around it and out the bottom. So this is a atmospheric vent. It has a little passageway all the way through the carburetor. It kind of goes flat and then it goes down. Goes down to the carburetor bowl. The purpose of this is to release the air that's on top of the fuel. So if you were to fill a carburetor up all the way up with fuel, you'd have to have a way for the air to escape. Otherwise, the air would just pressurize and wouldn't let any fuel in. It really comes more into play when we talk about the Venturi principle that goes on inside of a carburetor, but that's kind of understanding a little bit more of what a carburetor is doing. The purpose of this video is just to explain how to take it apart, what all the parts are, just some basic knowledge of this carburetor for you. So that's a basic rundown of how a carburetor works for this specific engine, everywhere from where the fuel's getting in to where the fuel's getting out. So for reassembly, basically you just do the exact opposite. You slowly put everything back together, being careful to watch, make sure you get the right screws in the right spot, the right jets in the right order. Once you have the carburetor reassembled, you can put it back on the engine. Be sure to clamp down everything, put your fuel line back on, put your air cover back on, air cleaner. Once you get everything hooked up, crank her over and see if she'll start.
Everybody, stop these big birds. Come see what Elmo did. Well, what have you done, Elmo? Well, Elmo wrote his own song. Really? What's it called? Elmo's Song. Oh, clever title. Yeah, I wish I'd thought of that. Well, does Snuffy and Big Bird want to hear it? Oh, sure. Okay. Gee, thanks for sharing your nice song with us, Elmo. Oh, that's okay.